The third and final way of civilizational progress is what we call humanistic secularism, where theistic secularism focuses on doing God's will in the world, and technocratic secularism on pushing back the limits of finitude by means of scientific, technological, and economic progress. Humanistic secularism is focused on overcoming contingency by making humanity the master of its own destiny, even, as we will see, to the point that it becomes the power of being as such. The roots of this tradition, like the other secular ways, lie in the crisis of the late Middle Ages. Specifically, humanistic secularism derives from a group of philosophers known as the radical Aristotelians. These philosophers, following the Muslim commentator on Aristotle, Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, interpreted Aristotle as upholding a number of propositions which the Catholic Church found problematic. First, they held that the universe was not created, but was rather eternal, the necessary expression of the attractive power of a God who, furthermore, acted only as final cause, drawing the universe into being and drawing it towards himself. Second, the Averroes argued that there is only one agent intellect for the whole of humanity. The agent intellect in Aristotelian philosophy is the faculty which abstracts ideas from the data we collect with the senses. It is also the part of humanity which is immortal. The radical Aristotelian position had the effect of reducing individual human beings to data collectors for the agent intellect, and it seemed to rule out any individual morality. The aim of human life, rather, was to gradually realize the potential of our humanity, something which happened gradually over the course of history, through political and scientific and philosophical progress. It's possible to trace the lineage leading from the radical Aristotelians through Spinoza to Kant, Hegel, Marx, and beyond. But for our purposes, it will be enough to identify four principal manifestations of this tradition. The first is liberal humanism. Here, the ideal of making humanity the master of its own destiny is focused primarily on the individual. There are, once again, numerous subvariants. John Locke, for example, understood freedom largely through the category of property. Property comes about when we create something. God created us, and therefore we are God's property. Because of this, no one can validly or licitly steal or harm us. And since we create things, we have property as well. Thus, the fundamental inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Immanuel Kant, on the other hand, grounded freedom in reason. As rational beings, we must act in a way which is rationally consistent. We cannot thus limit another's freedom without accepting comparable limits on our own, and we cannot treat another as a means to an end without instrumentalizing ourselves as well. Democratic humanism brings a collective dimension to the humanistic ideal. For Jean-Jacques Rousseau, authentic freedom is possible only on the basis of a social contract which can protect it. This means yielding our individual freedom to the general will and determining our destiny collectively through the democratic process. Hegel similarly saw in the modern state the means through which reason had finally triumphed in a system of institutions which embodies rational principles and collective self-determination. The Communist project, advanced by Karl Marx, was simply an extension of this democratic dynamic. The state provided some measure of collective self-determination, but so long as most people were forced to sell their labor power in order to survive, they were not really free to develop their creative potential. And for Marx, creative capacity is humanity's defining characteristic. Indeed, this is the real key to understanding Marx's critique of religion. Marx argues that religion is a problem because it ascribes a human capacity, creativity, to another being, God. He believes that this happens because human beings are forced to sell their labor power in order to survive, and thus experience their creative capacity as something alien to them. Communism, by overcoming the commodification of labor power, resolves this contradiction. And by making human beings the masters of their own creative power, communism also, in effect, makes human beings what religion tells us God is, the creative power of being itself. The fourth variant of the humanistic secular ideal is populism. Here it is the people as ethnos or nation, rather than demos or citizen body, which becomes the agent of human self-determination. There are many expressions of this outlook, but the most important philosophical articulation is that of Martin Heidegger, for whom each people or culture is the product of a unique unveiling of being, which in turn constitutes its way of life. While Heidegger is currently quite popular on the left, especially among so-called deconstructionists and other postmodernists, we should remember that he was an active member of the Nazi Party and saw Nazism as the political expression of his philosophy. This suggests that populism, while understandable as the expression of the aspirations of an oppressed people for liberation, is fundamentally a dangerous outlook. This is because it allows no real deliberation between peoples with differing and conflicting ideals. Postmodernism, and in particular its deconstructionist variant, is best understood as a self-criticism of the humanistic ideal. Given that none of the principal variants of that ideal, liberal, democratic, communist, or populist, has actually delivered the self-determination it has promised, philosophers have begun to question whether or not there is really any subject, individual or collective, capable of such self-determination, and reject all grand narratives, secular as well as religious, as inherently oppressive. But they do this, as their most prominent philosopher, Jacques Derrida, has conceded, in the name of an undeconstructible ideal, that of justice. So that philosophy becomes a kind of practice in service of justice, and, he argues, a return to the historic Jewish ideal.